An Unqualified Pilot by Rudyard Kipling. This tale is founded on something that happened a good many years ago in the port of Calcutta, before wireless telegraphy was used on ships, and men and boys were less easy to catch. When once they were in a ship, it is not meant to show that anybody who thinks he would like to become eminent in his business can do so at a moment's notice, but it proves the old saying that if you want anything badly enough and are willing to pay the price for it, you generally get it. If you don't get what you want, it is a sign either that you did not seriously want it or that you tried to bargain over the price. Almost any pilot will tell you that his work is much more difficult than you imagine, but the pilots of the Hughley know that they have 100 miles of the most dangerous river on earth running through their handsy Hughley between Calcutta and the Bay of Bengal. Say nothing, their service is picked and sifted as carefully as the bench of the Supreme Court, for a judge can only hang the wrong man or pass a bad law, but a careless pilot can lose a 10,000-ton ship with crew and cargo in less time than it takes to reverse her engines. There is very little chance of anything getting off again when once she touches in the furious Hughley current loaded with all the fat silt of the fields of Bengal, where the soundings change 2 feet between tides and new channels make and unmake themselves. In one rainy season, men have fought the Hughley for 200 years, till now the river owns a huge building with drawing, survey, and telegraph departments devoted to its private service, as well as a body of wardens who are called the port commissioners. They and their officers govern everything that floats from the Hughley Bridge to the last buoy at Pilot's Ridge 140 miles away far out in the Bay of Bengal, where the steamers first pick up the pilots from the pilot brig. A Hughley pilot does not kindly bring papers aboard for the passengers or scramble up the ship's side by wet swaying rope ladders. He arrives in his best clothes with a native servant or an assistant pilot to wait on him, and he behaves as a man should who can earn £2,000 or £3,000 a year. After 20 years' apprenticeship, he has beautiful rooms in the port office at Calcutta, and generally keeps himself to the society of his own profession, for though the telegraph reports the more important soundings of the river daily, there is much to be learned from brother pilots between each trip. Some million tons of shipping must find their way to and from Calcutta each 12-month, and unless the Hughley were watched as closely as his keeper watches an elephant, there is a fear that it might silt up, as it has silted up round the old Dutch and Portuguese ports 20 and 30 miles behind Calcutta. So the port office sounds and scours and dredges the river, and builds spurs and devices for coaxing currents, and labels all the buoys with their proper letters, and attends to the semaphores and the lights, and the drum ball and cone storm signals, and the pilots of the Hughley do the rest. But in spite of all care and the very best attention, the Hughley swallows her ship or two every year. Even the coming of wireless telegraphy does not spoil her appetite. When Martin Trevor had waited on the river from his boyhood, when he had risen to be a senior pilot, entitled to bring up to Calcutta the very biggest ships, when he had thought and talked of nothing but Hughley pilotage all his life to nobody except Hughley pilots, he was exceedingly surprised and indignant that his only son should decide to follow his father's profession. Mrs. Trevor had died when the boy was a child, and as he grew older, Trevor, in the intervals of his business, noticed that the lad was very often by the riverside. No place, he said, for a nice boy, but as he was not often at home, and as the aunt who looked after Jim naturally could not follow him to his chosen haunts, and as Jim had not the faintest intention of giving up old friends, there nothing but ineffectual growls came of the remark later, when Trevor once asked him if he could make anything out of the shipping on the water. Jim replied by reeling off the list of all the house flags in sight at the moorings, together with supplementary information about their tonnage and captains. "You'll come to a bad end, Jim," said Trevor. "Boys of your age haven't any business to waste their time on these things. Oh, Pedro at the Sailor's Home says you can't begin too early." "At what, please?" "Piloting. I am nearly 14 now, and I know where most of the shipping in the river is, and I know what there was yesterday over the Mayapur bar, and I've been down to Diamond Harbor Row 100 times already, and You'll go to school, son, and learn what they teach you, and you'll turn out something better than a pilot, said his father, who wanted Jim to enter the subordinate civil service. But he might just as well have told a shovel-nosed porpoise of the river to come ashore and begin life as a hen. Jim held his tongue. He noticed that all the best pilots in the port office did that and devoted his young attention and all his spare time to the river he loved. He had seen the nice young gentlemen in the subordinate civil service, and he called them a rude native name for clerks. He became as well known as the bankshawl itself, and the port police let him inspect their launches, and the tugboat captains had always a place for him at their tables, and the mates of the big steam dredgers used to show him how the machinery worked, and there were certain native rowboats which Jim practically owned, and he extended his patronage to the railway that runs to Diamond Harbor 40 miles down the river. In the old days, nearly all the East India Company's ships used to discharge at Diamond Harbor on account of the shoals above, but now ships go straight up to Calcutta, and they have only some moorings for vessels in distress there, and a telegraph service, and a harbor master, who was one of Jim's most intimate friends. He would sit in the office, listening to the soundings of the shoals as they were reported every day, and attending to the movements of the steamers up and down. Jim always felt he had lost something irretrievable if a boat got in or out of the river without his knowing of it. And when the big liners with their rows of blazing portholes tied up in Diamond Harbor for the night, Jim would row from one ship to the other through the sticky hot air and the buzzing mosquitoes and listen respectfully as the pilots conferred together about the habits of steamers. Once for a treat, his father took him down clear out to the sandheads and the pilot brig there, and Jim was happily seasick as she tossed and pitched in the bay. The cream of life that was coming up in a tug or a police boat from Diamond Harbor to Calcutta over the James, and merry those terrible sands christened after a royal ship that they sunk 200 years before. They are made by two rivers that enter the Hugli 6 miles apart and throw their own silt across the silt of the main stream, so that with each turn of weather and tide the sands shift and change under water like clouds in the sky. It was here the tales sound much worse when they are told in the rush and growl of the muddy waters that the Countess of Stirling 1,500 tons touched and capsized in 10 minutes, and a 2,000-ton steamer in 2, and a pilgrim ship in 5, and another steamer literally in 1 instant holding down her men with the masts and shrouds as she lashed over when a ship touches on the James, and merry the river knocks her down and buries her, and the sands quiver all around her and reach out under water and take new shapes over the corpse. Young Jim would lie up in the bows of the tug and watch the straining buoys kick and choke in the coffee-colored current, while the semaphores and flags signaled from the bank how much water there was in the channel, till he learned that men who deal with men can afford to be careless on the chance of their fellows being like them, but men who deal with things dare not relax for an instant, and that's the very reason old McEwen said to him once that the James and Mary is the safest part of the river, and he shoved the big black bandera that draws 25 feet through the eastern ghat, with a turban of white foam wrapped round her forefoot, and her screw beating as steadily as his own heart. If Jim could not get away to the river, there was always the big cool port office, where the soundings were worked out, and the maps drawn, or the pilot's room where he could lie in a long chair and listen quietly to the talk about the Hugli. And there was the library, where if you had money, you could buy charts and books of directions against the time that you would actually have to steam over the places themselves. It was exceedingly hard for Jim to hold the list of Jewish kings in his head, and he was more than uncertain as to the end of the verb audio if you followed it far enough down the page. But he could keep the soundings of 3 channels distinct in his head, and what is more confusing, the changes in the buoys from Garden Reach down to Saugur, as well as the greater part of the Calcutta Telegraph, the only paper he ever read. Unluckily, you cannot peruse about the Hugli without money, even though you are the son of the best-known pilot on the river. And as soon as Trevor understood how his son was spending his time, he cut down his pocket money, of which Jim had a very generous allowance in his extremity. He took counsel with Pedro, the plum-colored mulatto, at the sailor's home. And Pedro was a bad designing man. He introduced Jim to a Chinaman in Machuatala, an unpleasing place in itself, and the Chinaman, who answered to the name of Tze when he was not smoking opium, talked business in pidgin English to Jim for an hour every bit of that business from first to last was flying in the face of every law on the river, but it interested Jim. "S'pose you tacky can do tze," said at last. Jim considered his chances. A junk he knew would draw about 11 feet, and the regular fee for a qualified pilot outward to the Sandheads would be 200 rupees. On the one hand, he was not qualified, so he dared not ask more than half, but on the other hand, he was fully certain of the thrashing of his life from his father for piloting without license, let alone what the port authorities might do to him, so he asked 175 rupees, and tze beat him down to 120. The cargo of his junk was worth anything from 70 to 150,000 rupees, some of which he was getting as enormous freight, on the coffins of 30 or 40 dead Chinamen whom he was taking to be buried in their native country. Rich Chinamen will pay fancy prices for this service, and they have a superstition that the iron of steamships is bad for the spiritual health of their dead. Tze's junk had crept up from Singapore via Penang and Rangoon to Calcutta, where tze had been staggered by the pilot dues. This time, he was going out at a reduction with Jim, who, as Pedro kept telling him, was just as good as a pilot and a heap cheaper. Jim knew something of the manners of junks, but he was not prepared when he went down that night with his charts for the confusion of cargo and coolies and coffins and clay-cooking places and other things that littered her decks. He had sense enough to hold the rudder up a few feet, for he knew that a junk's rudder goes far below the bottom, and he allowed a foot extra to tze's estimate of the junk's depth. Then they staggered out into midstream very early, and never had the city of his birth looked so beautiful as when he feared he would not come back to see it. Going down Garden Reach, he discovered that the junk would answer to her helm if you put it over far enough, and that she had a fair, though Chinese, notion of sailing. He took charge of the tiller by stationing 3 Chinese on each side of it, and standing a little forward, gathered their pigtails into his hands 3 right and 3 left, as though they had been the yoke lines of a rowboat. Tze almost smiled at this. He felt he was getting good care for his money, and took a neat little polished bamboo to keep the men attentive, for he said this was no time to teach the crew pidgin English. The more way they could get on the junk, the better would she steer, and as soon as he felt a little confidence in her, Jim ordered the stiff rustling sails to be hauled up tighter and tighter. He did not know their nameset, least any name that would be likely to interest a Chinaman, but Tze had not banged about the waters of the Malay archipelago all his life for nothing. He rolled forward with his bamboo, and the things rose like Eastern incantations. Early as they were on the river, a big American oil, but they called it kerosene in those days, ship was ahead of them in tow, and when Jim saw her through the lifted mist, he was thankful she would draw all of 17 feet, and if he could steer by her, they would be safe. It is easier to scurry up and down the James and Mary in a police boat that someone else is handling than to cram a hard-mouthed old junk across the same sands alone, with the certainty of a thrashing if you come out alive. Jim glued his eyes to the American and saw that at Fulta she dropped her tug and stood down the river under sail. He all but whooped aloud, for he knew that the number of pilots who preferred to work a ship through the James and Mary was strictly limited. "If it isn't father, it's Dearsley," said Jim, "and Dearsley went down yesterday with the Bancora, so it's father. If I'd gone home last night, instead of going to Pedro, I'd have met him. He must have got his ship quick, but father is a very quick man." Then Jim reflected that they kept a piece of knotted rope on the pilot brig that stung like a wasp, but this thought he dismissed as beneath the dignity of an officiating pilot who needed only to nod his head to set Tze's bamboo to work. As the American came round, just before the Fulta sands, Jim raked her with his spyglass and saw his father on the poop, an unlighted cigar between his teeth. That cigar, Jim knew, would be smoked on the other side of the James and Mary, and Jim felt so entirely safe and happy that he lit a cigar on his own account. This kind of piloting was child's play. His father could not make a mistake if he tried, and Jim, with his 6 obedient pigtails in his 2 hands, had leisure to admire the perfect style in which the American was handled, how she would point her bowsprit jeeringly at a hidden bank, as much as to say, "Not today, thank you, dear," and bow down lovingly to a buoy, as much as to say, "You ray a gentleman at any rate," and come round sharp on her heel, with a flutter and a rustle, and a slow, steady swing, something like a well-dressed woman staring all round the theatre through opera glasses. It was hard work to keep the junk near her, though Tze set everything that was by any means settable, and used his bamboo most generously when they were nearly under her counter. And a little to her left, Jim, hidden behind a sail, would feel warm and happy all over, thinking of the 1,000 nautical and piloting things that he knew. When they fell more than half a mile behind, he was cold and miserable, thinking of all the million things he did not know or was not quite sure of. And so they went down, Jim steering by his father turn for turn over the Mayapur bar, with the semaphores on each bank duly signaling the depth of water through the Western Ghat, and round Makoputty lumps, and in and out of 20 places, each more exciting than the last, and Jim nearly pulled the 6 pigtails out for pure joy when the last of the James and Mary had gone astern, and they were walking through Diamond Harbor. From there to the mouth of the Hugly, things are not so bad, at least that was what Jim thought, and held on till the swell from the Bay of Bengal made the old junk heave and snort, and the river broadened into the inland sea with islands only a foot or two high scattered about it. The American walked away from the junk as soon as they were beyond Kedgeree, and the night came on, and the river looked very big and desolate, so Jim promptly anchored somewhere in grey water, with the Sauger light away off toward the east. He had a great respect for the Hugly to the last yard of her, and had no desire whatever to find himself on the Gasper Sand or any other little shore. Tze and the crew highly approved of this piece of seamanship. They set no watch, lit no lights, and at once went to sleep. Jim lay down between a Redan black lacquer coffin and a little live pig in a basket. As soon as it was light, he began studying his chart of the Hugly mouth and trying to find out where in the river he might be. He decided to be on the safe side and wait for another sailing ship and follow her out. So he made an enormous breakfast of rice and boiled fish, while Tze lit firecrackers and burned gilt paper to the Joss who had saved them. So far then they heaved up their rough-and-tumble anchor, and made after a big fat iron foremasted sailing ship heavy as a haywain. The junk, which was really a very weatherly boat, and might have begun life as a private pirate in Annam 40 years before, followed under easy sail, for the foremaster would run no risks. She was in old McEwan's hands, and she waddled about like a broody hen, giving each shoal-wide allowances. All this happened near the outer floating light, some 120 miles from Calcutta, and apparently in the open sea. Jim knew old McEwan's appetite, and often heard him pride himself on getting his ship to the pilot brig close upon meal hours, so he argued that if the pilot brig was get-atable, and Jim himself had not the ghost of a notion where she would lie, McEwan would find her before 1 o'clock. It was a blazing hot day, and McEwan fidgeted the foremaster down to Pilot's Ridge with what little wind remained, and sure enough there lay the pilot brig, and Jim felt shivers up his back as Tze paid him his 120 rupees, and he went overside in the junk's one crazy dinghy. McEwan was leaving the foremaster in a long slashing whaleboat that looked very spruce and pretty, and Jim could see that there was a certain amount of excitement among the pilots on the brig. There was his father too. The ragged Chinese boatman gave way in a most ragged fashion, and Jim felt very unwashen and disreputable when he heard the click of McEwan's oars alongside, and McEwan saying, "James, Trevor, ill trouble you to lay alongside me." Jim obeyed, and from the corner of one eye watched McEwan's angry whiskers stand up all round his face, which turned purple. "And how is it you break the regulations, o' the port o' Calcutta? Are ye aware o' the penalties and imprisonments ye've laid yourself open to?" McEwan began. Jim said nothing. There was not very much to say just then, and McEwan roared aloud, "Man, ye've personated a Hugly pilot, and that's as much as to say ye've personated me. What did yon heathen give ye for honorarium?" 120, said Jim. "And by what manner o' means did ye get through the James and Mary?" "Father," was the answer. "He went down the same tide, and it was steered by him." McEwan whistled and choked. "Perhaps it was with anger ye've made a stalking horse o' your father. Then, Jim laddie, hell make an example o' you." The boat hooked on to the brig's chains, and McEwan said, as he set foot on deck, Before Jim could speak yarns, an enterprising cub o' yours Trevor wide, better enter him in the regular business, or one o' these fine days hell be acting as pilot before he's qualified and sinking junks in the fair. He fetched yon junk down last night. If ye've no other designs, I am thinking I'll take him as my cub, for there's no denying he's a resourceful lad for all he's an unlicked whelp. That said, Trevor, reaching for Jim's left ear, is something we can remedy, and he led him below. The little knotted rope that they keep for general purposes on the pilot brig did its duty, but when it was all over, Jim was unlicked no longer. He was McEwan's property to be registered under the laws of the Port of Calcutta, and a week later, when the Ellora came along, he bundled over the pilot brig's side with McEwan's enameled leather handbag and a roll of charts and a little bag of his own, and he dropped into the stern sheets of the pilot gig with a very creditable imitation of McEwan's slow swaying sit-down and hump of the shoulders.